It was still warm when they found her car. September 3rd, 1998. A clear late summer morning along Route 16 near Fayetteville, West Virginia. Parked just off the shoulder was a faded blue Corolla. The engine was off. The driver's door hung half open. Inside, her purse sat on the passenger seat, undisturbed. Her keys were still in the ignition. There were no tire tracks, no blood, no broken glass, no sign of a struggle. But 5-year-old Lacey Whitmore was gone. She'd just finished her Thursday night shift at the diner off US 19. She clocked out at 9:47 p.m., waved goodnight to her coworker, then vanished sometime between there and the turnoff to her apartment. Barely a 6-minute drive. The only clue? A delicate silver bracelet snapped in two, found 50 yards deep in the woods. Beyond that, nothing. For years, her family clung to hope, running newspaper ads on her birthday, keeping her voicemail active just in case. Police chased every lead, but theories clashed. Some whispered she'd run off. Others believed she never made it past the tree line. And through it all, her name became a quiet ghost in town, spoken less and less as the years dragged on. But in 2013, during a routine renovation on an old hunting cabin deep in the hills, everything changed. What happened to Lacey Whitmore after she left work that night? And why did it take 15 years and a corpse's secrets to finally uncover the truth? If stories like this grip you like they do me, hit that like so more true crime lovers can find it. Comment where you're watching from, you're part of this true crime family now. And subscribe, it fuels this channel to bring you more stories just like this one. To understand what really happened that night, we need to go back to where it all began. It was just another Thursday. The kind of evening that blends into 100 others in a small Appalachian town like Fayetteville. Lacey Whitmore's co-workers at the Mountain View Diner remembered her, being in good spirits. She'd covered someone else's shift earlier that week and was finally heading home for a rare 3-day weekend. She even joked about sleeping in and finally starting that novel she kept talking about writing. Security footage showed her leaving through the back entrance at 9:47 p.m. She was wearing jeans, a white t-shirt, and a flannel button-up, her usual uniform. She carried no bags, no extra belongings, just her purse and her car keys. Her last known sighting was from a regular and off-duty fireman who waved at her from the parking lot as she pulled out onto Route 19. By all accounts, it was a normal night. Until it wasn't. The next morning, a local farmer spotted a blue Corolla parked strangely on a gravel pull-off along Route 16. It was angled like it had drifted during a hasty stop, with the driver's door left ajar. The keys were still in the ignition. Inside the car, everything was still there: wallet, ID, $23 in cash, a makeup bag, and a pack of chewing gum on the console. There were no signs of damage, no blood, and no disturbance. It looked like someone had just stepped out, but there was no Lacey. Her family knew immediately something was wrong. Lacey was reliable, obsessively so. She'd once called her mom in a panic because she was running 6 minutes late to Sunday lunch, not answering her phone, not showing up to her apartment. That wasn't like her. Not at all. By noon, a missing persons report had been filed. By 4 p.m., state troopers had taped off the car and launched a grid search. Over the next 48 hours, more than 100 volunteers, cadaver dogs, and search teams combed the woods surrounding Route 16. Helicopters scanned the tree canopy. Drones hadn't yet become a tool of choice in 1998, so everything was painstakingly manual. Crews walked shoulder to shoulder, looking for clothing, footprints, anything. The terrain was dense and unforgiving: rolling hills, deer trails, sinkholes, and moss-covered limestone that crumbled underfoot. But aside from that broken bracelet, found 50 yards off the roadside path, there was nothing. And that bracelet raised even more questions than it answered. It was hers, no doubt. Her sister, Megan, had given it to her for graduation. A small silver chain with a single sapphire bead, custom engraved with an L. But how had it snapped? And why was it so far from the road? Forensics found no blood on it, no signs of a struggle nearby. The dirt was undisturbed, the leaves not crushed. It was almost as if someone had placed it there. Investigators built out a timeline. She clocked out at 9:47. Her estimated drive time home was about 9 minutes. The last confirmed sighting was by the firemen at 9:48. Assuming she didn't stop anywhere and there was no record that she did, she would have reached the pull-off around 9:55 p.m. But why would she have pulled over there? It wasn't a scenic overlook. It wasn't near her apartment. There was no breakdown, the car was functional, and the tank was half full. She hadn't called anyone or sent any texts. Her call log was clean, no strange numbers, no voicemails, and there were no signs of a hitchhiker or another vehicle. Detectives began exploring alternate angles. Could she have willingly stepped out to meet someone? Was there a planned rendezvous no one knew about, or had someone been following her? When nothing turned up after the first week, the case began to pull apart at the seams. Local news ran segments for a while, interviews with her family, candlelight vigils, tips hotlines. But as days turned to weeks, the leads dried up. Rumors began to swirl, as they always do in tight-knit towns where silence breeds speculation. Some said she was depressed and had taken off. Others floated uglier theories that someone in law enforcement was involved, or that she'd stumbled on something she shouldn't have seen. The Fayette County Sheriff's Office held multiple press conferences, trying to keep the public engaged. They promised transparency, but behind closed doors, investigators were running out of steam. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no suspects, no movement in her bank account, no pings from her social security number. It was as if the ground had opened up and swallowed her whole. And for her family, the grief never settled. Her mother, Carol, refused to change the locks to Lacey's apartment. She kept renewing the lease, paying for it out of her retirement savings just in case Lacey came back. Her father, who had once worked for the railroad, started driving along Route 16 each night before bed, just to be close to where her car had been. Her younger sister spiraled into depression, dropping out of Marshall University after a semester. Detectives continued to follow any leads, no matter how far-fetched. A gas station clerk claimed she'd seen Lacey in Kentucky. A trucker thought he recognized her at a diner in Tennessee. Every sighting led nowhere. 6 months in, the media stopped calling. 1 year in, Lacey's name stopped appearing in the paper. And by the time her 3rd birthday passed with no new information, even the original investigators began retiring or moving to new assignments. But Carol never gave up. Every year on the anniversary of her daughter's disappearance, she left a bouquet on the pull-off at Route 16. Sometimes she left candles. Other times, just a handwritten note. Most years, she came alone. But once 5 years after the disappearance, she was joined by a stranger, a man in his late 50s. He stood silently beside her for several minutes, nodded, and walked away. Carol never found out who he was. And yet, 15 years later, that same stretch of road would come back to haunt the town again, when a construction worker broke through rotted flooring in an abandoned cabin just 12 miles from where Lacey vanished. And what he found buried underneath would change everything. The cabin was barely standing. Built sometime in the 1960s and forgotten just as quickly. It sat hunched behind a ridge in the cranberry wilderness about a dozen miles southeast of where Lacey's car was found. It had belonged to a retired game warden named Alan Stokely, who passed away in 2006. Since then, it had passed through 2 different owners, both using it more for hunting gear storage than for shelter. In the summer of 2013, a contractor named Joel Kinney was hired to do basic renovations, patch the roof, replace the warped floorboards, install a new septic line. He expected mold, maybe raccoons, but not what he actually found. On August 3rd, while removing floor planks in the back corner of the cabin, Kinney struck something that echoed hollow, a false bottom. Beneath it, a sealed wooden crawl space, reinforced crudely with old cinder blocks and lined with plastic sheeting. He pried it open with a crowbar. The smell hit him first stale, metallic, tinged with decay. Inside, wrapped in torn painter's tarp, were human bones. A partial skeleton, badly decomposed, alongside a rusted tin box containing 2 items. A Marshall University class ring inscribed LW 95, and a flannel shirt, blood-stained, the color long faded from red to rust brown. Kinney backed out immediately and called 911. By that afternoon, the cabin was swarming with forensic teams, crime scene analysts, and 2 stunned cold case detectives who hadn't said Lacey Whitmore's name out loud in years. They couldn't be certain at first. The remains were fragile, but the ring was undeniable. And when DNA from the flannel shirt was fast-tracked and compared against the 2006 CODIS upload backlog, the match came back in just under 72 hours. The shirt soaked in dried blood had once belonged to Deputy Harold Kearns. Kearns had been a deputy in Fayette County from 1982 until 1999. He'd quietly retired after what was described as a family emergency and moved to northern Ohio, where he died of a stroke in 2006. At the time of Lacey's disappearance, he had still been on active duty. The news stunned everyone. Kearns had never been interviewed as a suspect. He had helped search for Lacey. He'd manned one of the checkpoints during the first week of her disappearance. No one remembered anything unusual. No complaints, no reported conflicts, no history of misconduct. But behind closed doors, that story began to unravel. Investigators pulled his personnel file. It was thin, too thin for someone with nearly 20 years of service. Key pages were missing. There was no record of disciplinary actions, but also no commendations. Just a vague reference to reassignment in 1996 after a dispute with a fellow deputy. Next, they contacted his ex-wife, Marlene Kearns, now living in Pennsylvania. She hadn't spoken publicly in years, but when they showed up at her door with pictures from the cabin, she opened up. What she said reframed everything. According to Marlene, Harold had been an angry man, quiet in public, controlling at home. He kept strict routines, and any deviation, any questioning set him off. Around 1998, she remembered him coming home late one night, agitated and covered in what he said was animal blood. He showered in silence, burned his clothes in the barrel out back. She didn't ask questions. She was too afraid. 2 weeks later, she said, he took her out to that same cabin, told her it needed to stay off the radar. No guests, no visitors, no questions. She obeyed. When asked why she never came forward, her eyes welled with tears. Because back then, who would have believed me? He was law enforcement. I was just a scared wife. Investigators began re-interviewing people from Kearns's past. One former deputy remembered an incident in the mid-90s, Kearns arguing with a waitress at a local diner. The description, young, blonde, with a nervous laugh, sounded a lot like Lacey. Another remembered a peculiar moment during the original search. Kearns had insisted they skip a stretch of forest near Cranberry Ridge, claiming it was too unstable. No one challenged him. The circumstantial evidence was stacking up, but legally, it was too late. Kearns was dead. He'd never stand trial. Still, the case didn't end there, because when they searched his old property in Ohio, now owned by someone else, they found a locked gun safe hidden in the garage. Inside were dozens of personal items, women's earrings, hair clips, driver's licenses. One of them belonged to a missing woman from 1993. Another, a college student from 1996. What investigators now suspected was that Lacey wasn't the only one. Fayette County Sheriff Daniel Morris held a press conference, officially announcing the connection between Lacey Whitmore and Deputy Kearns. Her remains were confirmed through dental records. Her family was notified in person. Carol Whitmore collapsed in her kitchen when she heard. I always knew she was close, she said. I just never imagined how close, or who had been hiding her. The town reeled. A man trusted to protect the community had betrayed it in the worst way possible. And the deeper investigators looked, the more disturbing the picture became. But one question still haunted them. Why? Why Lacey? What happened that night? Was it premeditated, or a moment of sudden violence? Was she targeted, or simply unlucky? Those answers were still buried somewhere, possibly in the few remaining people who remembered what Harold Kearns had been like behind the badge. And one of them was about to come forward with a story that would crack open the final piece of the puzzle. Her name was Linda Mahoney. She'd worked in records for the sheriff's department from 1990 to 2001. Quiet, efficient, The kind of person you never really noticed unless you needed a form expedited. But after Kearns was publicly named in connection to the Whitmore case, she reached out to the task force via an anonymous tip line. She didn't use her name at first, just left a message. "I think I know what really happened to that girl back in '98. He kept a copy of her personnel file. I saw it. I know where it went." Detectives traced the call, brought her in, and what she said shifted the investigation again, this time deeper into the heart of the sheriff's office itself. Linda explained that in the fall of 1998, weeks after Lacey vanished, she was cleaning out old files from a shared cabinet when she came across something odd. A manila folder labeled Lacey Whitmore, Incident 091198, internal use only. That was strange for two reasons. One, Lacey hadn't worked for the department, so why would she have an incident file? And two, the date on the label was September 11, 8 days after she disappeared. Linda flipped through it. Inside were photocopies of Lacey's DMV photo, her schedule from the diner, and a handwritten page, likely Kearns's handwriting, listing dates, times, and locations. One entry stood out: 9/3, 9:35 p.m. Left via back door. Alone. No escort. Route confirmed. It wasn't part of any official case file. There was no investigation number. No arrest warrant. It read more like surveillance notes than law enforcement paperwork. Linda had barely scanned the last page when Kearns walked in. She froze. He didn't say anything. Just stared at her for a beat too long, then smiled. "Wrong cabinet," he muttered, and walked away. 2 hours later, that entire drawer was empty. The next day, the cabinet itself was gone. She wanted to say something, report him, but she was alone in that room most days. And after that, she started noticing strange things. Her tires slashed. Her back door unlocked when she knew she'd locked it. Once, her cat went missing for 3 days, only to return with a bloody paw. So she stayed silent until now. Detectives brought in Lacey's old manager from the diner, who confirmed Kearns had been a regular customer, though he never caused trouble. Always sat at the corner booth, always asked for Lacey, even when others were on shift. Back then, no one thought twice about it, but now, a pattern was forming. Kearns had created a profile: routine behaviors, timing, travel paths. He knew her rhythm, and he had the badge to avoid suspicion. Investigators began reanalyzing every step of Lacey's final night with fresh eyes. They found a small but crucial oversight. At 9:41 p.m., 6 minutes before she clocked out, a marked patrol unit was seen idling across the street from the diner. It captured briefly in the reflection of a bakery security camera. The cruiser was never reported on any call that night. The plates weren't logged in dispatch. The angle made the numbers unreadable. But it was a department-issued Crown Vic. Kearns had been off-duty that night, but back then, off-duty officers often took cruisers home. It was enough for the team to hypothesize a chilling timeline. He waited, watched, let her leave alone, maybe even flashed his lights to get her to pull over once she passed the tree line near Route 16. She would have recognized him, trusted him. What happened next no one could say for certain, but the blood on the flannel, the hidden crawl space, and the homemade surveillance notes painted a damning picture. Still, there was a missing piece. The property where Lacey's remains were found hadn't belonged to Kearns since the late 82nd. It was originally in his father's name, then transferred to a private trust after his death. Kearns hadn't officially owned it when Lacey disappeared, so why bury her there? A search of the trust records revealed that the cabin had never been fully removed from his access. He held the only surviving key. But more disturbing was what they found next: an undated photograph, deep in the archives of the family's estate paperwork, showing a young Kearns standing on the front porch of that cabin, smiling. Next, to a teenage girl no one could identify. Her eyes were hidden behind oversized sunglasses, but her posture tense, withdrawn, wasn't hard to read. It looked like a posed photo. Forced. Possibly taken without consent. There was no note on the back, no context, just the image. Analysts used aging software and facial comparison. The girl wasn't Lacey, but she was someone else confirmed missing from Greenbrier County in 1991. Suddenly, the implications stretched wider than anyone had feared. Was Kearns a serial predator who used his badge as cover? Was that cabin a disposal site? A trophy room? As state police reopened multiple cold cases tied to Kearns's time in uniform, Carol Whitmore did something unexpected. She asked to visit the cabin. Detectives were hesitant. The structure was barely safe, and the emotional weight was undeniable. But she insisted. She wanted to stand where her daughter's life had been stolen, to see it with her own eyes. They escorted her just before sunset. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stood quietly, staring down at the dirt where the false crawl space had been opened. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a laminated photo. Lacey, age 8, missing front teeth, holding a homemade kite and tucked it under a stone. I wanted her to have something of home, she whispered. What happened next would bring the emotional toll of this case to the surface like never before. Because less than 2 weeks after her visit, Carol received a letter. No return address, no name. Just a short typed message on yellowed paper. You weren't wrong. She was close. I always liked her flannel. It was postmarked from within Fayette County, which meant someone else still knew something. Someone still alive. The letter shook Carol to her core. For years, she had prepared herself for silence, had come to terms, in some way, with never knowing. But the message, simple, direct, and unmistakably personal, felt like a wound torn back open. You weren't wrong. She was close. I always liked her flannel. It wasn't just the words. It was the tone. Familiar, cold, almost proud. Detectives analyzed the envelope for prints, nothing usable. The paper itself was standard, the ink from a common inkjet printer. But the postmark? Fayette County. Mailed 3 days after her visit to the cabin. Someone had been watching her. Someone connected to Kearns. Or someone who was Kearns. Metaphorically an accomplice. A copycat. Or a keeper of his secrets. They opened a new investigative path, one focused not on Kearns himself, but on those around him. People who knew his habits, his routines, his temper. One name rose to the surface. Tommy Blackwood. Tommy had been Kearns's hunting buddy for over a decade, retired mechanic, quiet, solitary, and generally regarded as odd but harmless. He'd lived in a trailer 5 miles from the cabin and was known to disappear for days during hunting season. He was never interviewed in the original case. Why would he have been? He had no record, no connection to Lacey. But when investigators visited his property, they found something deeply unsettling. In his garage, pinned to the wooden wall with a rusted nail, was a faded photograph. Lacey, in her waitress uniform, smiling, slightly out of focus, as if taken without her knowing. It wasn't a photo her family had ever seen before. Below it, a sticky note. The kind you use for phone numbers or reminders. It read, "He always liked the flannel." Blackwood denied everything. Said the photo must have come from a box of old junk left behind by Kearns. Claimed he hadn't even noticed the note. But he was visibly shaken. His hands trembled as he lit a cigarette. When asked why he never came forward when the body was discovered so close to his home, he just shrugged. Didn't think it was my business, he mumbled. People die all the time out here. Police searched his home. They found more. The photos, some of Lacey, others of different women. None obscene, but all unsettling in context. Several had been taken from a distance, parking lots, diners, sidewalks. Some were decades old. Even worse, they found a journal, written in block letters, rambling, paranoid. Most of it was nonsense rants about the government, microwaves reading thoughts, neighbors spying through the trees. But sprinkled throughout were passages about the deputy and the girl who knew too much. One passage stood out. The deputy brought her to the cabin. She didn't want to stay. I told him not to. But he said it was already done, said it was cleaner this way. I didn't watch. It was vague, denial wrapped in implication, but in the eyes of the law, it still wasn't enough. Blackwood hadn't committed a prosecutable crime. He wasn't seen assisting. The journal could be dismissed as delusional fiction. The photos, while disturbing, weren't illegal. Still, detectives pressed, and eventually, something cracked. In a second interview, under soft lighting and with a recorder running, Blackwood leaned forward and whispered, "I didn't touch her, but I knew." He paused. He said she saw him off shift once, at the cabin. Said she'd recognized the cruiser. Said she'd told her sister he creeped her out. That changed everything. Detectives contacted Megan Whitmore, Lacey's sister, and asked a simple question. Did Lacey ever mention someone following her? Megan broke down instantly. Yes, she had. 2 weeks before she vanished, Lacey said a patrol car had followed her all the way from the diner to her apartment, slowed when she parked, lingered at the corner. She said she thought it was Kearns. She hadn't told their mom because she didn't want to cause drama. It was the first concrete indication that Lacey had been aware something was wrong, that she'd been scared, and perhaps that she knew she was being watched. Investigators pulled phone and records again, this time with fresh eyes. At 9:59 p.m., on the night of her disappearance, a brief cell tower ping registered from her phone just outside the wooded stretch near Route 16. A second ping, 2 minutes later, placed her near the edge of the Cranberry Hills. It had never been flagged before because it seemed to jump too quickly. But now, paired with what they knew, it suggested movement, a vehicle. She had been driven there, and most chillingly, she was likely still alive for those final minutes. Carol was told in person. She didn't cry this time. Just nodded slowly. She must have fought, she said. That's why the bracelet broke. Detectives now believed that Kearns had pulled her over using his authority. Perhaps claimed she'd broken a taillight, or that there was a safety concern. Then, once she was in his car, he drove her to the cabin. Whatever happened next, Blackwood was at least a witness. Possibly more, but charges never came. He lawyered up, claimed mental incompetence, and before a grand jury could be convened, he was hospitalized for a stroke. Within 2 months, he passed away in care, never confessing to anything further. To this day, no one knows how many others Kearns may have harmed, or if others helped him cover his tracks. But one final twist was still to come, because when Carol returned to the cabin one last time, accompanied by her pastor, she noticed something peculiar in the foundation tucked behind a collapsed plank. It was a small wooden cross, weathered, faded, but etched into it, barely visible. L.W. It hadn't been left by police, or by her, and investigators had never reported finding it. Whoever placed it there did so privately, secretly, perhaps out of guilt, or perhaps to mark the truth they never had the courage to speak. By the time winter settled in over Fayette County in late 2013, the Whitmore case had officially shifted from mystery to reckoning. The public now knew the name Harold Kearns. They knew what had been buried beneath that cabin. What they didn't know, what still gnawed at detectives, was how many other names were still out there. Names of women who never made it home. Names no one had connected until now. A full task force was assembled by the state, reviewing missing persons cases from 1,985 through 2,000, specifically from counties where Kearns had worked security shifts, attended hunting trips, or had family ties. Patterns began to emerge. Women between the ages of 20 and 30, usually blonde, often waitresses, retail clerks, or college students. Most disappeared late at night. Several were dismissed early on as runaways. 3 names kept surfacing. Shelby Nystrom, 22, vanished from a gas station in Nicholas County in 1991 after a late shift. Her keys were found inside the store. No sign of her car. Never recovered. Jenna Halbrook, 26, disappeared in 1996 while driving home from a friend's engagement party. Her vehicle was located 2 days later in Somersville, unlocked, undamaged, purse inside. And Robin Ellis, 23, a Marshall student who went missing in 1987. Her last known location, a hunting expo in Charleston. No body, no trace. All 3 cases had gone cold. No suspects, no evidence. Just voids. Until Blackwood's journal, Lacey's class ring, and that single flannel shirt cracked the dam. And yet, something still wasn't right. Because despite all the circumstantial connections, the physical evidence, the kind that prosecutors build airtight cases on, remained scarce. The crawl space held only Lacey's remains. No other biological traces. The photos found in Blackwood's trailer, while disturbing, didn't tie directly to any crime, but then came the break they didn't expect. In January 2014, a former forensic intern named Claire Reyes, working in an evidence archive in Charleston, flagged something odd. While digitizing old property logs from the late 90s, she came across a misfiled envelope labeled Disposal, Non-Evidentiary, 1999. Inside was a strip of undeveloped 35mm film, with a handwritten note, possibly related to Whitmore case, not usable. Submit for destruction, but it had never been destroyed. She turned it over to the new task force. Forensic labs developed the negatives, and what emerged changed everything. There were 6 images. Most were blurry. But one was clear enough to send a chill through everyone who saw it. It showed the inside of the hunting cabin, dimly lit, cluttered with tools and a wood stove. And in the lower left corner, partially in frame, was the outline of a person slumped against the wall, face obscured. But the flannel? The same red and white pattern Lacey had last been seen in. Someone had taken a photo of her, and someone, presumably Kearns, had submitted that film roll himself during the original investigation, then marked it for destruction, when it didn't develop well. But that meant one thing. He'd inserted himself deep into the investigation, not just as a searcher, but as someone controlling the flow of evidence. Even more disturbing, the timestamp on the negative sleeve showed the film had been dropped off at a 24-hour photo kiosk 5 days after Lacey disappeared. It was the smoking gun they'd never thought they'd find. And yet, it raised even more questions. Why would he take a photo of her? Was it a trophy? A compulsion? A record? Or was it proof that someone else was there too? One of the photos, number 5 in the strip, was almost entirely black. But in the upper right corner, with forensic contrast enhancement, investigators made out the edge of a boot, military style, scuffed. And here's where things took another sharp turn. In the old personnel records of Fayette County's 1992nd Volunteer Reserve Deputy Program, a now defunct division that allowed former military to serve part-time, there was one man with a known connection to Kearns, a former Army MP turned security guard. His name was Darrell Hulkcom. Hulkcom had served only briefly, from 1994 to 1997, before resigning over personal health matters. He lived off-grid now, in an isolated trailer near the Gauley River, surviving mostly off disability checks and bartering. When detectives approached him, he didn't resist. He invited them in, said he'd been waiting for this day. They found a flannel shirt hanging in his shed almost identical to the one from the crawl space. When asked about it, he said quietly, "We all had one back then. Harold gave 'em out like gifts." It was clear Hulkcom wasn't entirely lucid. Years of alcohol abuse, isolation, and untreated PTSD had taken a toll, but under questioning, his memories began to drift. "I didn't touch her," he said more than once. "I told him not to. Said it was too much this time, too young." He never named Lacey, but the implication was there. A search of his property revealed no remains, no physical evidence. But in a locked trunk beneath his bed, they found a stack of Polaroids, unmarked, unsorted. Many were landscapes, rivers, tree lines, but a few were women, blurred faces, candid shots. One looked like Shelby Nystrom, the gas station clerk from 1991. When presented with the photo of the boot from the recovered negative, Hulkcom simply said, "Could be mine." The case was turning darker by the day, not just a lone predator anymore, but possibly a pattern. A network of quiet enablers, men who knew, who said nothing, who perhaps helped clean up or looked away. Carol was briefed on the latest findings. Her response? "I always thought it was just him, just one monster. But now, I think it was a circle. And my daughter, she was caught in the middle." The district attorney was reluctant to pursue charges against Hulkcom. His mental state, the lack of direct physical evidence, it made prosecution a long shot. But in April 2014, a grand jury was convened. And for the first time in 16 years, someone big other than Kearns would be held publicly accountable for Lacey Whitmore's death. Hulkcom was indicted for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to conceal a felony, and tampering with evidence. He was declared unfit for trial by reason of mental incompetence and remanded to a long-term psychiatric facility. It wasn't the justice Carol had imagined, but it was something. And yet, even then, the full story still hadn't been told, because months later, a final sealed envelope would arrive at the sheriff's department containing a map, a set of initials, and a location where no one had yet searched. The envelope arrived quietly. No return address. Just a plain manila parcel slipped through the after-hours drop box at the Fayette County Sheriff's Department in mid-July 2014, 9 months after the discovery at the cabin, and just weeks after Daryl Hulkcom was declared unfit to stand trial. Inside was a hand-drawn map. The lines were careful, etched in pencil on yellow legal paper. A narrow river, a rocky ledge, an X scratched into the curve of a hillside. Beside it, 3 initials, R.E. Robin Ellis, the Marshall University student who vanished in 1987. The map matched a stretch of private land near Panther Ridge, owned by the same family who had once leased Kearns access for seasonal hunting. It was rough terrain, thick pine, hidden ravines, no road in or out. The kind of place you only find if you already know it's there. Detectives hiked in the following morning, accompanied by cadaver dogs and a forensic excavation team. It didn't take long. Beneath a shallow cluster of flat stones, partially exposed by recent rains, they found human remains, fragile, weathered by time and erosion. A single earring still clung to a shard of skull silver with a turquoise inlay. Robin's sister, Beth, confirmed it immediately. She wore those everywhere, she said. Our grandmother brought them back from New Mexico. Dental records sealed the Mexico identification. Robin had been buried for 27 years, less than 30 miles from where Lacey would later vanish. And the similarities didn't stop there. Like Lacey, Robin had disappeared after a night shift. Like Lacey, her car was found intact. And like Lacey, there had been no forced entry, no blood, just absence. With this discovery, everything changed. Public pressure mounted. Media outlets from Charleston to Pittsburgh ran specials connecting Kearns, Hulkcom, and now possibly others to a string of vanishings that had once seemed isolated. The task force expanded again. A new forensic team re-examined every cabin, crawl space, and woodland trail once touched by these men. And then, another name surfaced. A local contractor name withheld by request came forward to report that back in the late 90s he'd done siding repairs for Kearns's property. During lunch, Kearns had bragged about an extra guest room no one knew about. A storm cellar behind the shed, camouflaged by vines. No one had searched that storm cellar. In August 2014, detectives returned with a warrant and began excavation. The door had rusted shut. They had to cut it open. Inside, beneath the dust and rotted debris, they found 2 items. A lockbox containing several driver's licenses, some reported stolen, others tied to missing women. A spiral notebook, stained and water-damaged, but partially readable. It wasn't a journal. Not quite. It read more like a ledger. Dates, times, names or initials. In some cases, disturbing shorthand phrases like S knew, too late, M talked, done, L flannel, 9:50 p.m. L was Lacey. S may have been Shelby. M could have been Megan, but Megan was alive. That entry triggered alarms. Detectives re-examined Megan Whitmore's records. They cross-referenced calls made to her landline in 1998 and found 3 unidentified numbers, burner phones, long disconnected. One had placed 7 calls to her apartment the week after Lacey vanished, all at night, all under 1 minute. Megan had never mentioned them. When asked, she shook her head. I thought they were prank calls, just breathing. Then they'd hang up. Someone had been watching the family, monitoring their pain. But why? One theory emerged, dark but plausible. That Kearns, or someone working with him, had considered Megan a second target, that she'd been studied, too. But something stopped them, maybe timing, maybe fear, maybe guilt. Another theory? That Megan was left alive on purpose, to suffer, as a message, a cruel echo of control. The The psychological profile of Kearns, drawn up by FBI analysts at Quantico, painted a chilling portrait. Control-driven, calculated, likely narcissistic with dissociative traits. A man who viewed people as chess pieces, tools in maintaining power. And his badge? That wasn't just a job. It was his armor. When he died in 2006, it had seemed random, a stroke while unloading groceries. But now, with the puzzle assembled, some believed it was the only thing that ever stopped him. By late 2014, the task force concluded their primary investigation. Hulkcom remained in psychiatric care. No other living accomplices were identified with enough evidence to charge. But for the families of Lacey, Robin, Shelby, and Jenna, closure came in fragments. Carol Whitmore received Lacey's remains in a small, white urn. She placed it on the mantel next to a photo from her daughter's high school graduation. She got her name back, Carol said quietly during a press conference. She's not a missing person anymore. She's Lacey. She's my girl. Robin's sister buried her beside their parents in Mason County. Shelby's family held a private vigil near the gas station where she vanished. And Megan, once just the surviving sibling, became an advocate. She launched a nonprofit for families of cold case victims, working directly with law enforcement to change how missing persons reports are handled in rural counties. In early 2015, a memorial was unveiled outside Fayetteville. A modest stone marker etched with the names of 7 women believed to have been victims of Kearns or his circle. The plaque reads, "They were not forgotten. They were taken. And now, they are seen." But the town never fully recovered, because the truth left scars deeper than mystery ever had. A decorated deputy, trusted by the community, had used his badge as a mask, had turned search parties into theater, had walked among grieving families, offering comfort while carrying the weight of what he'd done. And perhaps the most haunting thought? If that crawlspace had never been opened, Lacey might have stayed a missing poster on a telephone pole, her story a half sentence, unfinished. Instead, her case forced the truth into the light, broke a chain of silence, and proved what one mother never stopped believing, that justice is not always swift, but it can still come. For 15 years, the name Lacey Whitmore lived in the shadows, passed around in hushed tones, remembered in missing posters, whispered at diner counters. People left flowers on guardrails. Teens told ghost stories about Route 16. But no one really knew. Now they do. What began as a cold case in a quiet corner of West Virginia uncovered something far more disturbing, a hidden world operating just beneath the surface, a network of silence, of power abused, of people looking away when they should have spoken up. Harold Kearns never faced trial. He never answered for the lives he took or the families he shattered. But his mask was torn off, his legacy erased, and the town that once gave him a badge will forever carry the weight of what he did with it. For Carol Whitmore, justice didn't come in a courtroom. It came in the form of a phone call, a flannel shirt, and a mother's intuition finally proven right. Her daughter wasn't lost. She was stolen. And the world finally saw the truth. Cold cases are never just about evidence. It's about time, about silence, about whether anyone is still paying attention. And sometimes, all it takes is one broken floorboard, one forgotten crawl space, to bring the whole truth crashing through the surface. Lacey's story is no longer unfinished. It's a warning, and it's a vow. We will remember, we will keep asking, and we will not let them disappear.